I'd like to jump right in today, picking up where we left off last time, talking about birds of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And we left off talking about the order Passeriformes, which are the perching birds. And there are a lot of perching birds in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's one of the most diverse orders of birds on the planet, and this is also in the ecosystem as well. So one subgroup to the Passeriformes would be the ravens, magpies, jays, and some of their relatives, which are all fairly closely related. The raven is a really common bird that we see up there, a very large black bird. And the ravens are really gigantic in the Yellowstone ecosystem. This is probably an adaptation to cold. Being bigger actually gives you less surface area for your volume, and so this is a cold adaptation. And in comparing, for example, ravens to crows, a couple of things that you can look for, and it's not easy to tell them apart, but size is one. Ravens tend to be bigger than crows. Also, ravens are usually described as having a Roman nose, so they have kind of a large hump, and then a straighter bill, doesn't hook quite as much at the end as a crow. Also, the throat feathers tend to kind of flare out a little bit compared to a crow. And when they fly, the tail feathers are more wedge-like as opposed to fan-like in crows, so more wedge-like in ravens. So again, very common bird, very smart bird, successful bird up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And you'll find them all over, from agricultural lands on the periphery, to the heart of Yellowstone and Tetons. A magpie, a close relative of crows, a very striking bird, again, a very smart bird, again, found throughout the ecosystem. And both ravens and magpies, for the most part, will spend the winters in the area as well. Just opportunistic, they'll feed on anything from eggs, small reptiles, amphibians if they can get them, vegetation, berries, just any and everything. Clark's nutcracker is a loud, kind of obnoxious bird. It's fairly medium-sized, kind of mockingbird size, maybe a little bigger than that. And they're one of the more intelligent birds in nature, quite honestly, and again, closely related to the gray jay, and I'll show you the gray jay here as well. So the gray jay is a close relative of the Clark's nutcracker, although it's a lot more quiet and less obnoxious. And again, these birds tend to be opportunistic. They'll feed on about anything as well, but a lot of seeds would be part of their diet as well. And both Clark's nutcracker and gray jay will cache food for the winter, as do some of these other birds. But the gray jay, again, is really good at this. And both Clark's nutcracker and gray jays, as well as other jays, exhibit some really high-level behaviors. They have extraordinary memories, so they will cache different kinds of seeds and different types of foods. Some high protein, some high fat, some high carbohydrate, and they can remember what type of food they have cached in different places. And the number of caches that they can keep track of are at least into the hundreds and perhaps even the thousands in terms of locations. Really amazing. There's been a lot of research recently on jay behavior. And what's also interesting is that they will change their behavior based on whether they're being watched or not. So in other words, they will be deceptive. If another jay is watching them while they're caching food, they will pretend to cache food. Or if they're feeding, instead of going to a place where there is food, they'll go to a different location and pretend to be getting food out of that. And then when they fly away, the bird watching will go to try to raid their cache, and there won't be a cache of food there. So again, these are really high-level behaviors, and later in the course, I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about animal behavior, but that's something that's pretty remarkable. You normally think of a bird, kind of bird brain, not being the brightest thing in the world, but a lot of birds are incredibly intelligent, including members of this family. And then the Steller's jay is another one that we sometimes see in the ecosystem as well. All right, warblers, again, a lot of songbirds in this group as well. So warblers are not uncommon. So this is the yellow-rumped warbler. Wrens, this is a house wren. So a lot of very small birds would fit into this group. The chickadees, this is the mountain chickadee here. Vireos, small songbirds. This is the warbling vireo. And all these birds are small, they're hard to see. Use your binocular spotting scopes as best you can, but they're usually hard to identify. I can't say that I'm a great ornithologist or a great birder out there, especially since I don't spend that much time in the ecosystem at any one time. And so when students ask us, when we have our field course, a lot of times students will ask me, well, what kind of bird is that? And I'll just tell them it's an LBB, which stands for a little brown bird. So that's one of the more common answers you'll get when you ask about some of these Passeriformes. But we do the best we can in that ecosystem. Others that we see, cowbirds are kind of an interesting bird for a lot of reasons, but we'll find them with the bison herds. And you can see here a couple of cowbirds, brown-headed cowbirds on the back of a large bison. Anyway, they'll follow along, and as the bison, disturb insects, they'll feed on those insects. They potentially can take insects even off the back of and fur of the bison. And then also they're interesting because they are what we describe as being nest parasites. So the cowbirds actually don't produce a nest of their own. They will lay their egg, the females will lay their eggs in the nest of another bird, typically some of these other songbirds that I've talked about. And so when the young chick hatches out of the egg, it will displace the other eggs in the nest, basically kick those eggs out of the nest, and then depend on this other species to raise them, and that's what happens. So the cowbird doesn't really raise its own young, it parasitizes other nests and lets these other songbirds do that. And it was thought that the cowbird female really didn't keep track of the young. She certainly doesn't feed them, but she apparently does monitor the nest, because there is some evidence that if the songbird does, and this is very rare, does recognize that that's an unusual egg or that's not the right chick and kicks that chick or the egg out of the nest, that the cowbird female will come back and destroy that nest, forcing that other species female to make a new nest and hopefully lay eggs again, and then perhaps she can parasitize that nest as well. Anyway, so the cowbirds are a very interesting little thing. So they look so cute, and then you find out, oh, they're so nasty. Swallows also fit into this group. There are a lot of different swallows in the ecosystem. Swallows are insectivorous. They feed on insects. They come out usually in the evenings. You'll see them in the mornings. Incredibly dexterous flyers. They have tremendous aviation abilities, really great flyers, fast, can turn on a dime. And so they're taking insects out of the air. They're basically feeding on aerial insects. And again, a lot of different varieties of swallows up there: the barn swallow, tree swallow, violet green swallow, cliff swallows, bank swallows. So just a lot of different types of swallows. It's a lot of times hard to distinguish one type from another on the wing, but if you can catch them at rest, then you can usually distinguish one from another. And then there are a lot of other Passeriformes here. I'm not going to list out all of the names of these, but I'll show you a couple of others that we see quite a bit in the ecosystem. There are a lot of blackbirds, red-winged blackbird. This is the yellow-headed blackbird. And then the dipper is really another very interesting member of the Passeriformes, because they basically fly in water. So you find the dippers along stream sides. You'll also find them along the banks of rivers, and so they dive into the water, and they're mainly looking for aquatic insects. They're looking for the nymph stages of the things like we talked about before, like mayflies and caddisflies, stoneflies, and so on. And that's what they'll feed on. But they literally will jump in the water, can actually swim underwater, and are really fun to watch. Now, another order, which is a real popular order, an obvious order up there, is the Falconiformes. So the Falconiformes include eagles, hawks, falcons, among others. And again, a fairly diverse order, not nearly as diverse as the Passeriformes, but again, these are generally large predators and they get a lot of attention. So, and some of them are important. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the Falconiformes. So certainly the bald eagle would be a major member of this group. Bald eagle we find along all of the waterways throughout the ecosystem. You'll find them along the Snake River and the Tetons, along all of the rivers up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, sometimes along lakes as well. Of course, it's our national bird, and the bald eagle population had crashed dramatically back in the 60s. That traced back to DDT, and we'll talk more about that later in the course as well. DDT was magnifying in the food chain and eventually killing these birds. And so as DDT was taken out of production, a lot of these predatory birds that feed on fish, like the bald eagle, osprey, pelicans, and so on, those populations have rebounded. So the eagle has been delisted. The population is relatively stable in the ecosystem. I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes as well. But it's really, again, one of the more dramatic birds in the ecosystem. Eagles are big, they're dramatic, obviously our national symbol, and you're looking at adults here. And so they generally mate for life, and if they lose a mate, then they will take another mate, of course. And again, they also, especially along the rivers, if they're nesting in a certain area, the national parks at least generally will close those areas where there are nesting eagles. Eagles like to nest in large trees. They will nest in conifers. Also, they'll nest in cottonwoods, and they really like cottonwoods preferentially. There has been an interesting dynamic between eagles and beavers, though, because beavers like cottonwoods too. And so when you have a lot of beavers, they'll be cutting down a lot of trees, quite honestly, and they have actually killed some eagles because they'll take down nests where there are cottonwoods, where there are eagle nests. And so in the Teton Park, in particular Grand Teton, they actually ended up trapping some beavers to try to protect some eagle nests. Another problem for some of the eagles, and this has impacted population to some degree, is that they are nesting in dead trees too. And so with the pine beetle infestations and the conifer deaths that are going on there, they're nesting in dead trees, and then some of those trees are blowing over. So the population has rebounded nicely enough so that they've been delisted, but we have seen a little bit of a decline in a few recent years due to the fact that we've had a couple of beaver problems and this blowing over of dead trees. And so eagles are primarily going to feed on fish. So during the summers, they're very dramatic. And again, these are a couple of nestlings that you can see here as well. And they will also, I wanted to mention on the nest, they will reuse the nest from one year to the next. So the nests are very large, and they can get extremely large and extremely heavy as they add to the nest year after year. So anyway, the eagles, like I said, in the summer in particular, will be feeding on fish, and that's why you find them along waterways. In the winter, they will feed on fish if they can, but they also may be feeding on carrion, occasionally small rodents, but mostly fish and carrion. Some spend the winter in the ecosystem. Some migrate out of the area, usually to the west, but it kind of depends on the particular pair. And in terms of their development, this is a young eagle. This is a first or second year eaglet. So you'll notice that they don't have the classic plumage right away. So it usually takes about 4 years for them to transition from this kind of a mottled plumage to the classic adult plumage with the white head and tail and dark feathers. Now, another eagle that we find in the ecosystem is the golden eagle. And the golden eagle is a massive bird, very dramatic bird as well. And they don't really overlap too much with the bald eagles, although in the winter they may both be feeding on carcasses. But the golden eagles we'll find up in the Lamar Valley. You can find them in some other valleys. You'll find them in some of the grasslands along the periphery of the ecosystem. But again, very, very large bird, fairly dark feathers. Can be confused with the red-tailed hawk, but the red-tailed hawk has that really classic red tail in flight. And they're just bigger. They're just so big, they're pretty dramatic. And so again, you'll find them out in the Lamar Valley. You'll find them out actually in this Mammoth area and beyond. Out to the west in some areas, in some of the grasslands, agricultural lands, you'll find them out there as well. And then the Tetons, especially if you get on the other side of the Tetons into the Idaho area, you'll find them there. Also in the Jackson Hole area, you'll find some bald eagles too. Or excuse me, golden eagles too. Okay, another bird is the osprey, also known as the fishing hawk. And so their range tends to overlap with bald eagles. So this is another bird that feeds on fish, and so they'll take fish out of the water. You can see that they have kind of a dark plumage. They have a mask, a black mask that runs on either side of the eye. And again, a really beautiful bird, also a bird that had problems with DDT, and their populations have rebounded as well. And they build large nests as well in trees along the rivers and lakes. They'll also build them on rock spires. So for example, in the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, that's a great place to look at osprey nests. You can look down into the nest and usually see the nestlings or fledglings there. And you might think that they're in direct competition with bald eagles, and they are to some degree, but not completely. The bald eagle is much bigger than the osprey. So eagles are going to be taking larger fish for one. Osprey will be taking smaller fish. And that's kind of the major separation. They also take the fish very differently. When eagles are fishing, they do it in kind of a soaring manner. So they'll come down and then snag the fish and then keep flying on by. And the osprey will usually be looking from a perch, then they will begin to fly, and then they'll hover actually. So they can hover over the river, and then they drop down and pick up their fish and actually have to basically kind of fly out of the water, get out of the water, to get enough air to start flying again. And the osprey are also kind of interesting because when they catch their fish, they'll always reposition the fish so that the head of the fish is facing forward. And I don't know what the point of that is, but it is kind of funny because you'll see them fumbling with fish sometimes until they get that head pointing forward, and then they'll take it back to a nest or a large branch or something like that and feed on them. So there is some overlap in what they do in the ecosystem. Generally, we consider in the ecosystem this principle of competitive exclusion, that no two organisms will have exactly the same job or niche in the same ecosystem. And so there is a little bit of overlap, but basically the size of the birds and the size of the prey that they feed on is what segregates them in that food chain or in that ecosystem. But having said that, I have seen ospreys battling over territory with other osprey, eagles battling with other eagles, and I have seen eagles and osprey battling with one another. And again, it's very dramatic. You know, their talons will lock in flight, and sometimes they're tumbling down and then separate off. And that's usually the young eagles or a young osprey battling with an adult eagle. So a young osprey with an adult eagle, or a adult eagle with a young osprey, usually where animals are trying to establish new territory along the river. Red-tailed hawk would be another member of the group that we see again throughout the ecosystem, a large hawk, generally soaring. So they're usually soaring above, and then they'll come down and grab their prey, primarily different types of rodents. The northern harrier hawk is one that we see in this ecosystem, and it's another hawk that is capable of hovering. So we sometimes see them hovering, looking for prey. And then also they'll be just kind of soaring just over the grasses, and then they'll dive down and pick up their prey. The peregrine falcon is also a pretty dramatic bird, a beautiful little bird. It has more of a cowl rather than a mask, but kind of a dark-headed cowl. The feet are kind of yellowish, some yellowish around the eyes. And the peregrine falcon is primarily feeding on birds that it takes out of the air. And so the peregrine falcons are among the fastest birds in the world. So when they go into their dives, they can reach speeds of 200 miles an hour. And we have seen peregrines, or I've seen peregrines out in the Slough Creek area, you know, fighting basically with red-tailed hawks and some other hawks, just bombarding them as these hawks are flying through their territory. So they'll just get up higher than so a red-tailed hawk will be flying through, they'll get up above it and then dive bomb down and knock out some feathers and so on. And the hawks don't usually seem to care, but they usually do keep going. So, but anyway, the peregrines are really spectacular flyers, just spectacular little birds. And there are many other hawks in the area as well, but this gives us some idea of what's there. Now, as it relates to some of these raptors, these Falconiformes, the ecosystem is a bit of what we call a biological sink, and this is especially true of the red-tailed hawks. We think also probably bald eagle, maybe osprey as well. In that, in the summers, this is a really lucrative area in terms of food supply. I mean, it's just really productive, and so as young birds get driven out of territory around the ecosystem, they'll move into this ecosystem looking for food. They'll usually find it in the summer, but then in the winter, of course, there's not going to be, fish aren't going to be as active, there aren't going to be as many fish, and then really the battles for territory begin. And so they'll actually starve in some cases in this area. So it is an area that draws wildlife in, and this isn't just for the raptors, but for some other types of animals as well. They'll be drawn into the area in the summer, early and late summer, when this area is really productive in terms of the food supply. And then they can't hack it during winter, and they may not know what the right migratory routes are to get back to an area that has more food supply. So you'll have a lot of animals dying in the fall and winter as they transition out of this tremendous food supply. So an area that draws animals in and then they die there, we describe as being an ecological or biological sink. So again, they'll move into this ecosystem and then can't get through the winter. Okay, another order of birds that you don't see as much of but are important in the ecosystem would be the Strigiformes, and the Strigiformes are the owls. And so when you look at owls, what's really distinctive about them, of course, are the large eyes, and so they are nocturnal feeders, and that's vision is going to play a role in that. But they also have dish-like feathers around the eyes, and so they have dish-like faces, certainly around the eyes. Sometimes the entire face will be kind of dish-like as well. And what that is significant, or the reason that is significant, is that it can actually collect some light. It can amplify light to some degree, but that's really about sound. That's really about collecting sound. And so the feathers actually will collect the sound and divert it to the corners of the dish, and that's where the auditory canal is that they hear with. And so owls are not so much visual predators as they are auditory predators. And so their auditory canals are slightly anterior compared to a lot of animals, and then they have this funneling effect. And so that really gives them depth perception with their sound, whereas you and I have visual depth perception. They actually have auditory depth perception, and so they will sit on a perch and they can turn their head, well, not 360 degrees, but about 270 degrees, some species. So they'll sit on a perch, they'll turn their head around, they're basically listening, and then when they hear rustling, they can hit that spot. Just as you and I would visually pick out a spot and hit it, they can, with their hearing, pick out a spot and hit that spot. So, so it's all about sound with owls. And another adaptation related to sound that owls have is that along the anterior edge of their flight feathers, they have little frills. And that really dissipates the sound so that they can fly very, very quietly. And I don't know if you've ever heard birds fly or been close to birds when they fly, but normally when a big bird, like some of these owls are flying, it's whoosh, whoosh, whoosh as they beat their wings. But owls, when they fly, I mean, there's virtually no sound. And I used to run a lot in the mornings, and I've literally had barn owls and other owls fly right over my shoulder, and I didn't hear a thing until they were right there. It's just unbelievable. And also I used to do a lot of research on bats, and so I would also be out in the field and see a lot of owls at night. But just amazing how quietly they can fly. So in this ecosystem, there are a large number of owls. I'm just going to point out a couple. Two of the biggest species. One, the great horned owl. You're looking at the great horned owl. These aren't really horns. These are just some feathers. They're probably used for display purposes. But it is a large owl, very powerful talons, one of the most powerful birds in the ecosystem. And then it's much more rare, but reportedly the great gray owl, I've never seen a great gray owl in the ecosystem, but the great gray owl is also reportedly found in some parts of the ecosystem up in Yellowstone. And this is a very, very large owl. But again, I haven't had the good luck to see one myself. But many other owls in this ecosystem as well. Saw-whet, screech owl, there's a bunch of owls up here. But if you want to see owls, you've got to get out at night, and usually you need a night that has some moonlight to it so that you can see what they're up to. Another large bird that we find in the ecosystem, this would be the order Gruiformes, and the sandhill crane would be one that we see quite a bit in the ecosystem. Sandhill cranes are really, again, beautiful birds. They're tall, about 4 feet tall, have kind of a red crest on the head. They migrate up from the Gulf of Mexico. There's also some other locations that they'll come up from, but they migrate long distances. They'll nest in the Yellowstone ecosystem and other regions further north. And they'll feed on about anything that they can find. They can feed on some grains. They also will feed on small animals if they can catch them. And then they're close relatives of the whooping crane. Whooping crane is a highly endangered animal. Numbers were very low. I've read as low as 19 back in the 1930s. I don't know if that number is really accurate, but I know the numbers were less than 40 total. I'm not sure if that 19 refers to the total U.S. population or one particular region. But the numbers were very, very low. They have recovered into the hundreds. They have historically used Yellowstone, but there are no, as far as I know, there are no longer any nesting pairs in Yellowstone right now. I have been lucky enough to see a pair that almost nested in the ecosystem, but unfortunately ended up dying. Anyway, but they're a large, very majestic bird as well. And part of the problem is in replacing this population was trying to teach them their migratory pathways. And so they are actually raised and trained to follow ultralight planes. And so many of them are actually initially taken to through their migratory pathways through these, with these ultralight planes. And we are now seeing a little bit of success with the next generations learning to follow their parents. And one of the areas that's really important for them is they're trying to establish a nesting population in the Grays Lake National Wildlife Reserve, a little bit in the southwest portion of the ecosystem. So that reserve has been established to try to have a nesting area for the whooping cranes. And again, they will nest in northern states and also in Canada in the winter, or excuse me, in the summer, and then spend their winters along the Gulf Coast, and also there's a reserve in Arkansas. Another large bird we see in the ecosystem is the white pelican. White pelicans are found, again, all along waterways. They also feed on fish. Really kind of look like a big doofus in a sense, but these are really graceful birds. They're beautiful flyers and surprisingly agile. I have seen a white pelican actually steal fish from an osprey. An osprey is a tremendous flyer, very acrobatic flyer, and I saw a pelican stay with an osprey for a very long time, maybe 10 minutes, and it was a young osprey, and I mean it just stayed on its tail forever until that osprey finally dropped the fish, and then the pelican went down and got that fish. But they generally work in groups, and they'll stick their bills all in the water at the same time. They have a large pouch that they use for filtering out the fish from the water, and again, primarily feeding on fish, but very successful bird in the ecosystem. The Anseriformes would be ducks, geese, and swans. The primary goose in the ecosystem is the Canada goose. So it's not the Canadian goose, it's the Canada goose, named for a zoologist who had the name of Canada. And again, migratory bird. They'll migrate into this area in the summers and migrate out, usually head south in the winter. So many different types of ducks. Can't even begin to get into the different types of ducks. But what's interesting about a lot of the ducks is that they do exhibit really dramatic sexual dimorphism. This is the Barrow's goldeneye, and they look like different species, but this is the male and this is the female. So again, we see sexual dimorphism in a lot of birds, whereas in other birds, males and females are almost indistinguishable. Usually in the waterfowl, we'll see very dramatic differences. So male versus female. Again, if you didn't know that, you might think they were different species even. This is a male lesser scaup. The female, again, would be very drab compared to this. Here we're looking at wood ducks, drakes and hen here. Again, tremendous dimorphism here between male and female. But again, lots and lots of ducks here. There's mallards, green-winged teals, blue-winged teals, just a lot of different species. And again, you'll find them all along the different waterways. And then the swan, the trumpeter swan is the native swan to the area. This is a bird whose population has been in decline primarily through predation, coyotes in particular, but other predators as well. They're particularly vulnerable because they will usually molt their flight feathers after they hatch out their young. The male and female molt at slightly different times, but there will be a period where they can't fly at all or can't fly well. And so they're particularly susceptible to predation at that time. So it's been relatively stable, but like I said, in the ecosystem generally, the swans have been in decline, and the Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Reserve is a place where their nesting grounds are protected. So this gives you a little bit of a taste of the diversity of bird life that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem. I'll talk about some other birds in the ecosystem in a supplement to this particular module, but compared to reptiles and amphibians, extraordinary diversity of birds, and we're going to see a similar diversity as we begin to talk about mammals. See you next time.